In this video, we'll take a look at Eliza Haywood's Fantomina, a novella or long short story published in 1725. First, I'd like to extend a warning about the story and this video. Fantomina features a rape scene and some complicated exploration of love, sex, and consent. As I indicate on the modules page this week, if this will be triggering for you, you do not have to read this story. Simply email me and I will assign you an alternative reading. In this video, I hope to offer some context and scholarly interpretations of the story's treatment of sex and consent in the 18th century, so we can study how a woman attempts to write a story that allows her heroine to explore her desires more openly in a culture that tended to stifle or control women's sexuality. Analysis of the characters, their motivations and actions, and Haywood's intentions are open to many different interpretations. I will offer some in this video and invite you to develop your own and explore them on this week's discussion board. Fantomina was published in 1725, and it was quite a daring work of amatory fiction. The story's initial setup would not be quite as controversial. A naive young woman falls prey to the amorous attentions of a more experienced man, and sadly, many readers of the time would not consider what happens to be rape in the way that we now understand. For many, a woman's consent was immaterial. There was no such thing as spousal rape. In fact, that has even been a debate into recent history, unfortunately. And the kind of asking for it rhetoric that our society has worked to dissolve would have been commonly assumed in this period. But what was considered controversial about the story was that the main character, Fantomina, spends much of the story actively seducing a man for her own enjoyment. Scholar Catherine Kraft proposes that Fantomina is particularly important to study because it both mimics and subverts sex and gender conventions of the time, as we see them represented in 18th century literature. The fallen woman story was a common trope in which a young woman loses her virginity, and is punished for it. While Haywood bookends her story with some conventional tropes like this, the bulk of the story is actually much more focused on women's desire than would have been considered appropriate, especially when being written by a woman. So as Kraft writes in her analysis of Fantomina and other amatory fiction by Aphra Behn and Charlotte Lennox, quote, "Women writers who wished to be radical would probably not have been read. Allowing for the fact that many women who wrote did so for money and needed to be accepted by both male and female readers, women writers who wanted to incorporate new views of the relations between men and women and still get those works past the censorship of critics had to produce narratives that seemed at first glance to be no different from the tales told by men. Women's fictions, however, often contained elements contradictory to and critical of the ideology of men's writing about women." So, what did these tales told by some men look like that Fantomina is writing in response to, according to Kraft here? In the 17th and 18th century, poems and fiction often featured character types known as the persecuted maiden or fallen woman, and these stories chronicled the misadventures of naive young ladies who lose or risk losing their virginities. Now, if the character maintains her virginity, she may be redeemed for any other innocent missteps and be married by the story's end, such as in an 18th century novel by Samuel Richardson called Pamela, with the rather on-the-nose subtitle of Virtue Rewarded. But if such a character loses her virginity, whether by choice or by force, she's likely to be punished in some way, by sickness, death, or social disgrace, such as in the book, also from the 18th century, Roxana, by Daniel Defoe, in which a woman seems to profit at first from her many extramarital affairs, but eventually she ends up in prison, where she repents of her supposed sins, but dies. So even if the character repents of what is believed in the culture to be a sin, she'll still likely meet a sad end. The audience might be encouraged to pity her, but importantly, she's rarely allowed to find a happy ending if she's had sex outside of marriage. So that is the standard plot. How does the story of Fantomina compare? Let's take a look first at the title character. Her name isn't actually Fantomina, but it's easier to call her that than just say the lady the whole time we talk about the novel. After all, Haywood titles the novella after that name. However, Fantomina is the name she takes on in her very first disguise. Initially, we meet her as a nameless, high society young lady who's visiting the city, seems to be alone. We're told she's of distinguished birth, beauty, wit, and spirit. She doesn't have anybody in town with her, so no one's holding her accountable for her actions. We get the sense, if she's witty, if she's high society, she's educated, but we also learn that she's quite naive and sheltered. We're told she was young, a stranger to the world, and consequently to the dangers of it, because she spent most of her life in the country. Now, our heroine has a flaw that will lead to her downfall, or so the conventional plot of a story like this one tells us. In this case, she's impulsive, possibly because she's used to getting what she wants as a result of her upper-class standing, and with no chaperone to keep an eye on her, she's able to pursue her desires for attention and feed on her vanity. So upon spending a night at the theater and observing sex workers flirting with men, she decides that she would like to see what that's like. And so she comes back another night to a play dressed as a high-class sex worker, and she enjoys the attention that a woman of her actual class would not have been given in such a forward manner. That would have been considered inappropriate, but in this case, she's able to flirt, to hold conversation with men in a way that she's not accustomed to, but enjoys. Now, the fact that we begin the story in a theater is significant. Eliza Haywood was herself an actress at one point. She wrote plays. She would have been very familiar with theater culture and its interesting mixture of social classes and behaviors. It wasn't so long ago that women weren't even allowed to act on the stage because it was considered inappropriate. It might lead to women being even more deceptive than they were already thought to be. It was often debated if women should even attend plays, because here's a place where the lower classes and upper classes sometimes mixed. And theater is, of course, all about performance, and what is a play but lies and deceit, someone pretending to be someone they are not. And as an audience member, you're watching these other people pretending and getting caught up in their deceptions. And this was thought to sometimes be too potentially confusing and a bad influence on the delicate minds of young ladies. So theater has often been held up as a potentially sinful place. So for Haywood to place her heroine, young and unsupervised, in a playhouse means trouble is bound to happen. But it also sets the stage for a major theme of the novel, which is Fantomina's own skill with the art of performance. Because when it comes down to it, it's not just the actors who are playing parts. Everyone is performing. Flirtation is a sort of game or a script that somebody learns that is crafted to yield particular reactions. The sex workers in attendance know how to act to attract the attention of these upper-class men. As Beauplaisir, Fantomina's love interest, later explains, very few of them were ladies or gentlewomen, but they learned to pretend enough to pull in many of a higher class who maybe wanted that kind of experience. So likewise, most of the admirers, the men, are acting in a particular way in order to, continue the flirtation. It's a game that they play, but what's not being said is a scene that they are trying to orchestrate. The sex in exchange of money. That's the end goal. But this is something that Fantomina doesn't quite understand underneath these performances. But she is fascinated by how the interactions between these men and women are freer than any she's ever been allowed to experience because of her social standing and her expectation of being virtuous and pure. She's been taught to follow her own social script, which ensures that women of her standing behave a certain way to attract a husband and not a lover. She tells us, or the narrator tells us, that she's had previous interactions with Beauplaisir. She'd often seen him in the drawing room, had talked with him, but her quality and reputed virtue had kept him from using her with that freedom she now expected he would do, and has discovered something in him which had made her often think she would not be displeased if he would abate some part of his reserve. Now was the time to have her wishes answered. So when she decides to pretend to be a sex worker, to come back another night to the play so that she can take on this other persona and flirt freely, she's fulfilling a wish that she has had, but she may not understand what this kind of flirting typically leads to. Now, women of the upper classes in the 18th century were expected to prize what was often called their virtue or honor, that is, their virginities, and save this for their future husbands, who may or may not be men that they had any choice in, as many marriages were still arranged and often made with thought to how it benefited one's family. Now, marriage for love was on the rise to some degree, and regardless, a woman was intended to look and act in a certain way to attract a good husband. She would don a particular costume, in a way, corsets and hooped petticoats under the dress, sometimes a powdered wig, depending upon which country and era we're talking about, and she would be expected to be educated in and display what were often referred to as accomplishments. And this included playing an instrument, maybe the harpsichord, singing, painting, dancing. And it would be good to be familiar with general topics of conversation that an educated man would be interested in, but not so much that it looked like you knew more than him. And while this happens, this quote below comes from a little bit later, about 100 years later, actually, from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, where she's kind of summing up what a woman is often expected to be like. It's still pretty true in the 18th century as well, so I've included this here. And so this is spoken by Caroline Bingley, who is one of the vain, kind of antagonistic characters of Pride and Prejudice. She's put in contrast with Elizabeth Bennet. And so here's what she describes that a woman is expected to do. She must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and modern languages. And besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions, or the word accomplished would only be half deserved. So there's this extra something that a lady must have, something that she's expected to embody, to perform, in effect. And this was how you got yourself a husband. Now, once married, a wife was expected to stay faithful to her husband. Much of upper-class marriage revolved around acquiring an heir. So if a woman had an affair and gave birth to another man's child, that risked the husband's line of succession. Now, expectations for men, on the other hand, what did that look like? So men's behavior when it came to heterosexual relations in the 18th century. Of course, there were plenty of men who were faithful to their wives, and there were certainly men who remained virgins before marriage, I'm sure, but there's actually not a lot of writing about that. What we do know is that it was entirely acceptable for men to have sex before marriage, in complete contrast to women. And though in polite society you wouldn't talk about it too loudly, it was relatively common for men to have mistresses outside of their marriages as well. So we see this modeled in the character of Beauplaisir. Single men like him might sleep with sex workers, serving girls and maids, even widows. But if they were well-mannered, they wouldn't go trying to sleep with a woman like Fantomina, in her real identity anyway. Such a woman was for marrying. But men, like women, didn't always get to pick the people that they married for love, or any other reason. So sex in marriage might be seen as simply for procreation. That's definitely not exclusively true, but it was for some. So a mistress was an easy solution if you had the money. Not exactly a sex worker, though some sex workers might become mistresses. A mistress is what was often called a kept woman, someone who noblemen or wealthy men would put up in an apartment somewhere, pay for their rent essentially, and come to visit them to engage in an affair. And as Kay Lynette Irwin points out in her discussion of sex and marriage in the 18th century, the only sin that a man ever committed with his mistress happened when he fell in love with her. History is rife with stories of noblemen who fell in love with their mistresses, but few, if any, ultimately abandoned their wives and children and/or titles and positions in order to marry their mistresses. Ultimately, the mistress was abandoned, whether it be by pressure from society or by the man's death, and in these cases, the mistress was generally left shattered, both emotionally and financially. So we see the double standard that's addressed earlier in the module in the poetry of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. And that's something that all of the women we're reading this week work to disrupt in their literature and in their frank discussions of women's desire. In Fantomina, we see the heroine expressing a wish to explore her desires more openly and equally. In her first disguise, she flirts with Beauplaisir, a man who has shown appropriately restrained interest in her in the past when they've met under her real identity. And she's kind of been crushing on him, and now she gets the chance, when she's in the disguise of a sex worker, to talk to him more freely, which we see here. And Beauplaisir's reaction to her is that she's different than other women that he's been flirting with at the theater. It says, perceiving she had a turn of wit and a genteel manner beyond what is frequently to be found among those wretches, who are for the most part gentlewomen, but by necessity, few of them having had an education suitable to what they affect to appear. He changed the form of his conversation. In fine, they were infinitely charmed with each other. He was transported to find so much beauty and wit in a woman, who he doubted not but on very easy terms he might enjoy, and she found a vast deal of pleasure in conversing with him in this free and unrestrained manner. Now, of course, this is where we start to get into dicey territory. Beauplaisir believes Fantomina to be what she is pretending to be, a sex worker, and he expects this flirtation to lead to a particular conclusion that Fantomina has not, in her inexperience, really anticipated. So this is the part of the story in which other tales like this one would present the heroine as a fallen woman if she has sex before marriage. Beauplaisir is in the wrong here, clearly, but that would not have been the popular interpretation of the time period, and though it's very clear to us that Fantomina does not consent, and Beauplaisir takes what he wants anyway, the idea that a sex worker could say no would have then been virtually unheard of, and sadly, even now, women can be treated similarly. Reading Haywood's story is a challenge, considering that the bulk of the narrative focuses on Fantomina's pursuit and persistent seduction of Beauplaisir when it begins with him raping her. Now, historically, this story has, since been regarded as a milestone work in women's fiction, and even a feminist work in allowing Fantomina to take on an active role in her sexuality after this scene, that is. But how can we ignore this part of the story? We can't, and we shouldn't. So let's take a look at the language here. Supper being over, which was intermixed with a vast deal of amorous conversation, he began to explain himself more than he had done, and both by his words and behavior let her know he would not be denied that happiness, the freedom she allowed him had made him hope. She had now gone too far to retreat. He was bold, he was resolute, she fearful, confused, altogether unprepared to resist in such encounters, and rendered more so by the extreme liking she had to him. Shocked, however, at the apprehension of really losing her honor, she struggled all she could, and was just going to reveal the whole secret of her name and quality, when the thoughts of the liberty he had taken with her, and those he still continued to prosecute, prevented her, with representing the danger of being exposed, and the whole affair made a theme for public ridicule. So Beauplaisir is without a doubt forceful, and as you read on in this scene in the book, it goes on and she explicitly tells him that she's a virgin and doesn't want to proceed, and he doesn't take no for an answer. In fact, the narrator tells us that even if he knew her true identity at this point, he still probably wouldn't have stopped. And it's not okay whether he acts this way toward a woman he thinks is a sex worker or toward an upper-class lady. It's rape, regardless. Had Beauplaisir done this to an upper-class young woman, though, he still would have been the villain, but she would have suffered a worse reputation in the time. She'd be considered off the marriage market, and her only hope would probably be what happens in the end anyway, going to a nunnery. Or, as Beauplaisir predicts, this would become a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. She'd become what she pretended to be, a sex worker. Now, normally, this would be the part of the story that in another author's hand might suddenly shift and moralize and blame the characters, including Fantomina, but that's not what happens. So, what are we to make of this scene? Now, what Haywood chooses to focus on here in her language is Fantomina's inexperience and confusion and her fear of losing her honor and what could happen to her reputation if anyone finds out. And so that's a choice to emphasize that very clearly, the fear of losing her virtue and honor and what people might say and what will happen to her if that gets out. So let's take a look at how another writer has interpreted this element of Haywood's story. Now, Fantomina remains of interest, not just to scholars, but to anyone interested in women's literature and women's history, especially since it deals with topics that are still relevant, like sexual desire and consent. The Mary Sue website, it's a pop culture site that often focuses on women in movies, TV, books, comics, video games, and one of their writers, Princess Weeks, wrote an interesting article about Fantomina, from a 21st century perspective, and her interpretation is actually quite similar to other, some academic scholars in trying to see what kind of within the limitations of her own culture and literary tropes, Eliza Haywood might have been trying to do with this setup. So here's what Princess Weeks has to say. The story exposes how ladies within high society are not allowed to express their sexuality openly the way men in high society can. It also shows in that time, even when a woman wants to have sex, unless she's a sex worker, Fantomina Incognita, she must always either pretend to not want sex, like Celia, or be a widow and therefore not a virgin, like Mrs. Bloomer. Fantomina initially doesn't want to have sex because of her reputation. Her virginity has value, not because she wants it, but because without it she is a fallen woman. Yet, she also enjoys having sex, and the only way she can continue having it is to play these different roles and further separate herself from the nameless woman she was before. Fantomina is without a doubt problematic, but it signals a time when female authors were trying to tell these stories in a different way, to deal with their own anxieties, and to have the focus of the forced seduction trope to be told from the perspective of the woman and not the rapist. So, in a way that may be difficult for us to understand, Haywood may have seen the rape as a necessary plot ingredient to allow her character, in the time in which she was writing, to be able to have sex without judgment. Once she was no longer a virgin, that barrier to Fantomina's sexuality is gone, and now she can learn what she desires rather than what someone else desires from her. Now, as the scholar Catherine Kraft noted in the quote that I introduced earlier in the video, this may be Haywood's way of sort of getting past the censors, hiding her subversive story in sheep's clothing. So she opens the story with this, in what was considered a typical way, but then she proceeds to allow her heroine in the rest of the story to make her own choices, explore her own sexual desires, and repeatedly fool the man who betrayed her. Now, of course, this is one interpretation, and it in no way absolves Beauplaisir of his actions, and Haywood may still want us to be critical of him and the kind of masculinity he represents in this era. But for now, let's take a look at Fantomina's thoughts and choices after this encounter with Beauplaisir. Once she's convinced him that she's not actually a sex worker, she invents the persona of Fantomina, a person not unlike herself, but doesn't use her true name, and then she begins an affair with Beauplaisir, much like a mistress would. So as the story continues, we see Haywood candidly discussing the sexual desire that Fantomina feels and comes to understand better, and we see her exercising her agency, that is, independence and control over her own life. Haywood repeatedly emphasizes that Fantomina's biggest fear is people finding out about her loss of virginity, and once she feels that she's safe from that secret getting out, she focuses on what she wants. So we see these two distinctions here. First, the narrator tells us that Fantomina had discernment to foresee and avoid all those ills which might attend the loss of her reputation, but was wholly blind to those of the ruin of her virtue, and having managed her affairs so as to secure the one, grew perfectly easy with the remembrance that she had forfeited the other. So once she realizes she has, she's crafted these disguises, she can protect her reputation, the fact that she has lost her quote-unquote virtue doesn't really matter to her. And now when she decides, okay, he's getting sick of Fantomina, I'm going to invent another persona so that I can have an encounter with him again. This is how she describes it. Her design was once more to engage him, to hear him sigh, to see him languish, to feel the strenuous pressures of his eager arms, to be compelled, to be sweetly forced to what she wished with equal ardor, was what she wanted, and what she had formed a stratagem to obtain. There's a typo there that should say she. So the language here is still somewhat troubling, but it's in keeping with the time period. Fantomina wants to be with Beauplaisir sexually here, but she still, like many others, sees sex as something that the man is in control of. He is the aggressor, and so she uses phrases like compelled and sweetly forced, but indicates that she wished with equal ardor. So she has desires similar to his, but is struggling to find the language for it because she, like many other women, was never taught that she could want that. The narrative of someone taking something from her, as Beauplaisir did, rather than sharing something with her, is more common. But Haywood is allowing Fantomina to take over the narrative, to kind of take over the typical story, and to write her own, in which she creates her own characters, she orchestrates the seductions, and she lets Beauplaisir think he's the one doing the seducing when he's really not. It's an inversion of power, and maybe a way for Fantomina to reclaim her agency. So as you read this story and follow Fantomina through various disguises, read closely and think about Haywood's choices, the language she uses in each encounter, the thoughts that she gives to Fantomina, and the behavior that Beauplaisir portrays. You might consider some of these questions as you're reading. Do you think that Fantomina asserts her sexuality and agency, or is she just playing herself, setting herself up again and again to, get disappointment from Beauplaisir? Does the novel subvert the standard loss of innocence plot, or does it merely uphold it? Does Haywood intend for us to recognize and focus on the rape, or does she use it as a quote-unquote necessary plot device to explore Fantomina's actual desires? How do we understand and analyze an 18th century story from a 21st century perspective when it comes to sex, gender, and consent? Does the novel critique Beauplaisir's behavior, or tacitly support it in Fantomina's continued love for him, or at least pursuit of him? What might we deduce about the role of class and how women are treated as we see Fantomina take on different disguises? She crosses social class lines. Does Fantomina perhaps occupy a place of privilege, being able to adopt and abandon disguises rather than be forced to live the difficult life of a real sex worker or maid or working class woman in this time period? Does the ending of the story punish Fantomina, or simply serve as a necessary concession tagged on at the end, to once again, like Catherine Croft said, to get it past the censors? Those are just some questions to consider, but I'm sure many of your observations will go beyond this, and I look forward to seeing how you interpret this story. So go ahead and read Fantomina if you haven't yet, and then return and watch the second video to focus in on a couple of things rather than spoiling it all in advance.